I hope and trust that you guys have been enjoying the Lent series so far. We had Josh last week talking about the spiritual discipline of the Word of God and how if we don't have that sitting within us, we might find it difficult to understand the language of God. And today I'm going to be continuing on with the discipline of rest. And you're not going to be hearing from a master this morning. I'm terrible at it. You know, when a recipe tells me to rest the meat at the end, I never do it. I am team straight to the plate. Anybody else? I just cannot wait. And you know, when I work out, the hardest part for me is not the squats, the deadlifts and the burpees. It's the cool down. The slowing down, it just seems like such a waste of time. I find it so difficult to do. And that struggle isn't just true for me in the gym or in the kitchen. Truthfully, it's true in my spiritual life as well. Because for a long time, I believed that my worth was tied to what I do. And that if I stopped striving, I'd be forgotten. If I didn't keep proving myself, I wouldn't be valuable. So I worked. I pushed. I said yes to everything, convinced that rest was selfish, that slowing down meant falling behind. And I think in Christian circles we can be a bit wired this way. If we see a need to rest as greed. Now I made that up. But I've felt that. I've really felt that before. And the problem with that mindset is that it keeps you busy, but it doesn't keep you healthy, spiritually or physically. Now, I've burned out before in my young life already, more than once. I pushed my body so far that it gave out. I could only work 3 hours a week for quite some time. I spent days in bed. And honestly, 10 years later, I still haven't fully recovered. I now live with a permanent limp, a limit on what I can handle, because I ignored rest until it was too late. But here's what I've come to realise. Rest is not weakness. It's courage. It's not laziness. It's trust. It's surrendering control and believing that God holds everything together even when we're not striving to fix it. So this morning I'm going to pose to you, what if the key to fruitful service isn't actually working harder, but resting deeper? What if the secret to doing what God has called you to do isn't pushing yourself to the limit, but learning to sit before you serve? In Luke 10, Jesus addresses this topic head on in the well-known account of Mary and Martha. Let's have a look. Luke 10, verse 38. Now, as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. But Martha was distracted with much serving, and she went up to him and said, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me." But the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her." Now, truthfully, I've always struggled with this passage. Probably, yes, I understand. It's one of those passages that gets preached on at nauseum at women's conferences. And the main takeaway being, are you busy in the kitchen or are you sitting at Jesus' feet, right? And the main implication, of course, is that sitting at his feet is the right answer and the kitchen is somehow the wrong choice. But here's the problem that I'd always have listening. What about the responsibilities? I mean, they exist. It's easy for Jesus to say sitting at my feet is better, but what about the practical needs? I mean, if anybody was going to eat, have a clean bedpan, and have somewhere to sleep that night, someone had to leave Jesus' feet, right? And I found myself frustrated by the seemingly simple answer that Jesus offers to Martha. It almost feels like an oversimplification. Sit at my feet, forget the dishes, Martha, no worries. But is that really the whole picture? Is that really what's going on here? Is resting at Jesus' feet always superior to engaging in service? Now, the deeper question here, I think, isn't about whether sitting or serving is inherently better. It's actually about the rhythm of both. Jesus isn't saying there's never a time to serve or attend to responsibilities. And we can see that because right before the verses we just read is the story of the Good Samaritan. And that is all about action, about having your life interrupted, about using your resources to help someone in need. And I think if we told Jesus at that point that we'll just sit at his feet and pray about the man that was beaten up at the side of the road, he would have said, you've chosen the wrong portion. Serving and getting our hands dirty in the needs of those around us is absolutely at the heart of being a disciple of Jesus. But here we come to this encounter with Martha and Mary, and Jesus is showing us something else. That discipleship is not just about doing. What he's offering us here, what he's showing us here, what Luke is showing us here in this progression is that there is a rhythm to our discipleship. A rhythm of retreat and engagement, of rest and of work, of being and doing, of abiding and action. Martha's problem was not that she was serving. It's that she had become anxious and distracted in her serving. She wasn't serving from a place of rest anymore, aligned with the will of God. And let's be honest, we've all been there, haven't we? Distracted, anxious, overwhelmed, juggling a million things, trying to serve, trying to love well, trying to do everything right, but so depleted and distracted that we can't even hear the Spirit's voice over our own busy minds. And maybe for you it's the endless to-do list. Maybe it's the pressures of always needing to be the dependable one, the helper, the fixer. Maybe it's even church work playing on your mind. We can absolutely be doing lots in ministry and still too distracted to notice what Jesus actually wants us to do. And here's the warning in Martha's story. When our service drowns out the Spirit's voice, we've lost the rhythm. When our ability to notice, respond, and be shaped by the Spirit is dulled, we've lost the rhythm. And losing our rhythm means we're often frantic instead of fruitful. We're often striving instead of abiding. So resting in Jesus isn't about rejecting responsibilities. It's about making sure we are connected to him before we take them on. If we serve without first sitting at Jesus' feet, we don't just run on empty, we run restless, weary, and ultimately disconnected from the one we're actually trying to serve. But when we start with rest in him, our service flows from a place of peace and not panic. So here's my first question for you all. When was the last time you truly sat before you served? When did you last pause to simply be with Jesus before diving into your day, your work, or even your first conversation? And I'm not talking about your prayers to God and reading your Bible. I'm talking about actually making space to hear from a living, loving God. He's your Father. He wants to talk to you. But the question is, are we still enough to listen? And how easy is it for all of us to get caught up like Martha did? And you know, I feel for Martha. She wasn't just being corrected by Jesus. She wasn't just being busy and stressed. There was a lot going on for her in the social context of the day. She wasn't just frustrated with Mary, and she wasn't just flustered. She was fighting against deeply ingrained expectations about what it meant to serve, and Jesus was about to blow it all out of the water. Mary's actions were completely scandalous on two fronts. First, she was sitting at the Lord's feet, and this was a common phrase to use to describe learning closely from a rabbi. In other words, you were a trained student. This wasn't just a posture. She wasn't just literally sitting there. This was a place where she decided to come and engage with the rabbi. It's really difficult to give an example of the difference, but the difference is you're all sitting here hearing my public teaching. What Mary was doing, what a disciple could do, was go, Jess, come over for lunch. I want to drill you more about what you just preached about. That's a disciple, somebody who could ask questions and wrestle with the rabbi and learn personally from him. And we see the Apostle Paul uses this same phrase in Acts 22 when he's defending himself to the Jews, and he goes, I'm a Jew. I was educated at the feet of Gamaliel. He was saying that he was taught directly by him. The problem was women weren't allowed to say that. In a culture where women weren't permitted to be disciples, Mary's choice was both audacious and dangerous. It was completely threatening Jesus' reputation as a respected teacher, and it was bringing dishonor to her family. This wasn't just unusual behavior. This was a PR nightmare. To understand just how scandalous this is, I mean, it's hard to imagine 2,000 years later. But listen to what another first century Jewish rabbi said about women doing this. If any man gives his daughter a knowledge of the law, it is as though he taught her lechery. This same rabbi said, better to burn the Torah than teach it to a woman. Now, I want to be clear, not every rabbi agreed with this fellow. He was definitely on the conservative end of the spectrum. But it doesn't mean that women weren't allowed to know the rules of the Torah or learn how to act right. They were allowed to learn that, but they certainly weren't allowed to ask questions or study it. They weren't permitted to be somebody who engaged with the scriptures and could help with interpretation of them. So here she is, Mary, sitting at his feet as a disciple. Maybe she asked a question. Who knows? This rabbi, Eliezer, he's not just saying that it was unnecessary to teach a woman. He was saying it was improper, inappropriate, and immoral. Believe me, eyebrows would have been raised at this scene. And I can imagine Martha, probably the older sibling, probably the older one, the one who invited Jesus into her home, just trying to get Mary's attention, hissing at her, get out of the room. I mean, that's probably what I would be doing. But the scandal didn't stop there. There was another layer going on. Mary wasn't just breaking cultural norms, she was neglecting the duty of hospitality, which women were the hands and feet of in that culture. It was an honour, shame-based society. The love language of your honour system was to pour them out with hospitality, and Martha was there alone, trying to do it all. She could not give Jesus and his close 12 disciples the hospitality that they deserved on her own. And so in her anxiety, Martha turns to Jesus, desperate to put a stop to this scandal. She goes, Jesus, tell her to help me. And Jesus says, no. Now, I don't know about you, but I just sometimes get truly overwhelmed by Jesus' humility. This wasn't just a correction going on here. Jesus was taking a public stance that would cost him culturally and personally. By publicly defending Mary's choice, he took a massive hit to his reputation that day. He was willing to be criticised, misunderstood, and very likely questioned as a respectable rabbi from that moment on, just so that Mary could sit at his feet. And I find it interesting in all of this scenario, the eyes would have been on Mary and Jesus going, what are you two doing? And yet it was Martha who was the stressed one. I think there's a lesson there for all of us. that when we truly rest and sit at Jesus' feet, that other stuff just doesn't seem to matter as much. It's as if Jesus is saying, I'm willing to lose face to pursue a relationship with you. And Mary's willing to lose face to pursue an intimate relationship with me. But Martha, are you? In our world today, resting in Jesus might not cost us our reputation in the same way it did for them. But I think it does come with sacrifices for us today. It may mean stepping away from the noise of our busy lives, turning down invitations we're expected to go to, saying no to work demands, things that impact your career, things that impact your reputation as a hard worker. I mean, aren't people who work 100 hours a week glorified? It could feel like we're falling behind. It feels like we're missing out. In a culture that values constant activity and achievement, choosing to rest in Him might make us feel out of place or even guilty for not being productive. If there's anything the West worships and idolizes, it's productivity. But just like Mary, when we make the choice to sit before we serve, we're choosing intimacy with the Saviour over the expectations of the world. And in that space, we find peace, we find clarity, and purpose that nothing else can give. But I must say, Christ's humility goes a lot further than what He asks of Mary or Martha or you and me. This wasn't just a moment of humility from Jesus, it was a preview of the ultimate humility He would show us on the cross. When we think about what it cost Him to offer us a place at His feet, we realise it wasn't just His reputation on the line here. He was willing to give His very life. He paid the ultimate price, not just for Mary to sit at His feet, but for all of us to be able to come to Him. No barriers, no restrictions, full and precious access. And when we grasp that truth, we understand that our time spent with Him, truly resting at His feet, is actually the most valuable thing we can offer Him, because it's the very thing He gave everything to restore. Friends, we're living in a world that never stops. The tasks never end. The expectations keep growing and the pressure to perform is always present. But Jesus invites us to a different rhythm, one where we sit before we serve, to pause, to breathe, to allow ourselves the space to be filled by Him before we pour ourselves out. And the world tells us that rest is lazy, but for the disciple of Jesus, rest is worship. It's an act of trust that God holds everything together, even when we stop. Now, I know it's easy to hear that and wonder, well, what does that look like in my busy life? And I get it. I'm a mum of 2 toddlers and I hold 2 jobs. It's like someone put my life in a blender called high chaos and hit start. I get how life can become stressful and overwhelming very quickly. But what I've discovered is that in this season of busyness, resting in God has never been more crucial. And the world demands so much from us, our attention, our time, our energy. I'll even say it hunts for it. It doesn't just demand, you will hunt for your attention. You're either going to be busy or distracted if you're not intentional. But the truth is, resting in God doesn't mean we're instantly free from tiredness or that we'll feel refreshed in the way you might expect. Instead, rest anchors us. It helps us to focus our energy, making us more intentional with how we invest it, rather than letting it get scattered and drained on things that don't matter. I had a psych friend tell me once, she said, Jess, the opposite of stress and anxiety isn't relaxation, it's focus. And as Isaiah 26:3 reminds us, you will keep perfectly peaceful the one whose mind remains focused on you because he remains in you. It's focus. When we rest in God, even in the midst of chaos, he keeps us at perfect peace, able to focus on what matters most. Beloved, if you're always busy, if you're always distracted, always consumed by the demands of life, how can we expect to hear God speaking? The Spirit doesn't shout. There are no hearing aids in the kingdom. If we don't quiet our minds and our souls, we will not hear him. And when we don't hear from the Spirit, our faith quickly turns into a life of rules, shoulds and coulds. Who's been there? And we know the burden of that can be backbreaking. It's exhausting. Christianity was never meant to be a life of relentless doing. It's about a relationship. And resting in Jesus is what strengthens that relationship. When we don't take the time to rest, when we keep pushing without pausing, we start to feel the cost. Distraction creeps in as we struggle to stay focused on what really matters. Anxiety builds as we try to do it all and keep up with the world's demands. Burnout sets in, leaving us drained and depleted. Bitterness can seep into our hearts as we resent the constant pressure and we feel distant from the voice of God. Without resting in Jesus, we're left running on empty, and we begin to serve out of obligation instead of overflow. So how do we rest? Well, resting can be as simple as a Sabbath breath. A few minutes in your day where you pause and say, Jesus, I need you. Or speak, Lord, your servant is listening. And I know several of you practice this already. It's about reconnecting with him throughout your day, helping you and training you to stay focused on him, even if it's just for a moment. To let him fill your heart, to let him fill your mind. And this is a great practice for those who are in high chaos season of life. Maybe you're a parent. Maybe you're a grandparent engaging with your grandkids. Maybe you're looking after an aging parent. Or maybe you're holding a full-time job and studying at the same time. A Sabbath breath can be a good practice for you. But there's also the practice of a Sabbath day, traditionally from sundown to sundown. But for Josh and I, we prefer the rhythm of lunchtime to lunchtime. We like that rhythm. And during that time, we put our phones away, we step back from work, and even retreat socially to recalibrate with each other and with God. It's a way to intentionally disconnect from the demands of life and reconnect with what truly matters. It's a key strategy to stay focused. This is one I encourage everyone to practice, actually, as often as they can. And of course, you'll probably fall off the bandwagon like we often do. But it's something we always tempt to regain very quickly. Personally, my journey with burnout has made this a non-negotiable for me, a priority that's become essential to my well-being and my ability to serve from a place of peace. And then there are Sabbath seasons. There are times in life when you may be called to slow down and retreat from the busyness of life and of the world around you. These seasons are deeply life-giving, allowing you to participate in the rhythms that are slower and more intentional, so you can thrive in the long run. For example, before Josh and I took up this role, this position, we requested 4 weeks off so that we could recalibrate and seek God's guidance for this new chapter in our lives. It was a precious time of rest and focus. And I want to say it's different to a holiday or vacation. It was intentional about seeking God's will and God's voice in our lives. Now, some people even take a year-long sabbatical, and I can't tell you how much I want to do that one day. But don't worry, it won't be anytime soon. And the truth is, I can't stress this enough. Rest is not a luxury. It's a spiritual discipline that sustains us. Whether it's a breath, a day, or a season, these rhythms of rest are essential to following Jesus and serving him well. It's not laziness. It is essential worship for the disciple. So I ask you, what would it look like in this season for you to sit before you serve? To take a moment a day, or even a season, to rest intentionally in his love and allow that rest to fuel everything you do, to seek his voice, to make his spirit whisper louder in your hearts and minds. So let's sit before we serve, friends. Let's slow down enough to reconnect with him, who gives us strength and direction for all that he calls us to do.